Hi, this is Andy from GPS Training. In this video, I'm just going to talk about USB charging cables for your Garmin handheld GPS device. We often get a lot of calls in the tech support about type of cable to use and where customers are having issues charging the built-in batteries in their new range of Garmin GPS devices. So what you'll find is in the newer generation devices we get choices of units that come with built-in batteries, like this 86i I've got lying on the table now. We also have 66 units that have built-in batteries, and also the Montana 700 range. Now those batteries you charge directly in the unit from the USB cable that comes with the device. So on the 86i's and the 66 devices we have a micro USB connection. On some other devices we still have the mini USB connection. Now all Garmin GPS devices are supplied with a genuine Garmin cable. And what we look for on the Garmin cables, you'll find they rate the cores of the cable. This is the thickness of the cable in size. And what you'll find is the two cores that are used for charging a unit tend to be slightly bigger than the data cores. Now what we find sometimes on cheaper or alternative cables, these cores aren't thick enough to actually charge the unit properly, and that's when you can have issues. We sometimes see on our cables, you often need a magnifying glass to view it, but on the side of the cables, I've got an example here, this is actually a Belkin cable, and when I actually look on the cable, there's writing on the cable, and when you look up the spec of the writing, or you find something that is called AWG, which stands for American Wire Gauge Conductor Size, it has a sizing for the cable cores, the copper cores inside the black sheath. And what you look for on that number, the higher the number, the actual thinner the cable is, daft as it seems. So what we tend to find on USB cables with the Garmin cables, they have at least two cores that are marked as 24 AWG. Those two cores at 24 AWG are the ones that put power into your battery from the charging plug. Some of the cheaper cables, or cables that aren't up to spec, have a number that is 28 AWG for all of the cores, and that often isn't enough to get the power into the Garmin battery. So that's why we tend to stick with the Garmin cables, because we know the cores for power are satisfactory. Enough in core size. Also, some cables you buy are only charging cables and they're not actually data communication cables, so when you plug it into a computer, that's sometimes why you find your computer doesn't detect the device. So just to give you some examples of cables here, so this one here I've got on the right hand side, this black cable, this is a genuine Garmin cable. It's got the Garmin logo on it, and when we looked up the spec on this cable, like we say, the charging cores, which is the copper wire inside the black sheath, were the recommended 24 AWG. But this other cable was just this cheap cable that I was sent back with a trade-in unit. You can see straight away it is a thinner cable, and actually when you look at the markings on the cable, which sometimes is hard to see, but all four cores on this cable are 28 AWG, so they're thinner than the Garmin cable. The other example I've got on this side here, I've got a Garmin micro USB cable, so the type of cable I'd use with this 86i, and again when I looked at the spec, there's two cores are this bigger 24 AWG, the other two cores are 28, but that's fine, that's for the data transfer. Interestingly, I've got this Belkin cable that we had in a customer had sent us, and what we found is it wasn't charging the GPS device, and even though it doesn't look an awful lot different in thickness, when I looked up the spec of this Belkin cable, the two cores that are used for power are the thinner 28 AWG, so that's possibly why I've got the issue of it not charging. The other thing I noticed, the Belkin cable is actually a longer cable than the standard Garmin cable, and when you read up spec on USB cables, as soon as you start getting a longer cable, you should have thicker cores of copper cable to get that power to your unit from your charger. And I noticed the recommendation tends to be something like 22 AWG, which is a thicker core when you've got a longer cable, which this Belkin one doesn't have. So we always recommend sticking with your genuine Garmin cable. The other thing to look at is the type of plug that you're using to charge your device. So you might have the right cable, but have you got the right plug? So some of the examples I've got here on different plug types, I've got one here that I've marked 1 amp hour. So actually when I looked at the writing on the actual plug itself. I had to get a magnifying glass to see it, but it tells me that it's a 1 amp hour charger. Now what you'll find is a 1 amp hour charger, which is basically 1000 milliamp hours, which is the current that it will put out. If you've got a Garmin battery that is just over 3000 milliamp hours, which my one in the 86i is, potentially that's going to take 3 or 4 hours to charge. Whereas I've looked at a plug that's actually got a higher rating. So this plug here, I've just put a sticker on to remind me what it is. It's a 2 amp hour plug. So when I looked at the spec on the plug, again, this writing's pretty hard to see, but I zoomed in using a camera and a magnifying glass, I could see it was a 2 amp hour plug. So that in theory should charge twice as quick as my 1 amp hour plug. I've also got an Apple plug here, which when I looked at the spec of this Apple plug, it was 2.1 amp hours. So again, that should charge my device in theory twice as quick as a 1 amp hour plug. So it's always worth checking the spec of the plug that you're using. The same goes if you connect your device to a USB port on a computer. It will charge when it's plugged in, but the older USB 1 and USB 2 ports only tend to put out about 500 milliamps, which is actually half the current that comes out of this 1 amp hour plug. So it's going to take a long time to charge from the USB port. If you do have a computer that has a USB 3 port, that tends to give out about 900 milliamps. So it's very similar to this 1 amp hour plug. So it will actually charge your device, but it may take some time to do it. So I would just be careful and make sure where possible you're using a genuine Garmin cable, because it is down to the core size and actually the quality of the copper that they put in the cable. The other thing we found is a lot of customers use emergency power packs to charge their devices. At GPS Training, we keep a range in stock. We have Gold Zeros and we also have the Power Travelers. And what's interesting, when you look at the spec of your emergency power bank, ideally, if you want to charge something a little bit quicker, say it's a bigger device like a handheld GPS, I would look for something that has a 2.0 AH, which is 2 amp hour output. Some of the smaller charging devices I know that we stock, the smallest Power Travelers have a 1 amp hour output, but they're absolutely fine when you're charging something like a Garmin GPS watch that has a much smaller battery in it. Something like a Fenix 6 watch, the battery, a Fenix 6X watch, the battery's around 450, 500 milliamps, so it's a lot smaller than the 3000 milliamp battery in a handheld device. So you can use something like a 1 amp hour plug or an output of 1 AH from your emergency power pack. But one of the power packs that I like that we stock is this one called the Sport 25 Power Traveler. And when I looked on the spec on this one, and you read through the spec, it actually tells me that the output for charging is a 2 amp hour quick charge. So that will be great for charging something like my handheld device, the same as if I was using one of my 2 amp hour plugs. So I hope you found this video useful on just sort of a general chat about USB cables and charging plugs and where we need to be careful. Try and use a 2 amp hour plug if you can, and try and use the genuine Garmin cable, or at least a cable that you can tell is definitely data and power. And where you've got the 2 power cores, they're a 24 AWG or a smaller AWG, which means the cable will be thicker. And we hope you found this useful, and thanks for watching.